canti and 14th century Italian poetry, and so you can tell he is somebody whose knowledge of Italian and European literature is vast. He's published, and I should say that all of you know Jean Ferracca, who has her weekly radio program. Luigi was one of her special guests, where he talked about Italian cuisine about 2 years ago. So he's very well known in Wisconsin, and we're absolutely delighted that he comes back. It will be another year before he's back, and you'll see him again, because he's one of our favorite people on the face of the earth. Luigi Ballerini, not for long, if he keeps that up.
Okay.
Luigi Ballerini has published many volumes of poetry, and when you come today at 4 o'clock, I will tell you he has published over 10 volumes of poetry in Italy and in the United States, in Italian, in English, and in his Milanese dialect. And so he is somebody who has a very interesting poetic itinerary. He has also published scholarly studies of Italian literature. He has gathered together anthologies, the most important anthologies of Italian poetry available to us in the United States today. In fact, perhaps he'll show you The Promised Land, Italian Poetry After 1975, a bilingual edition, which we also have in the library, along with other anthologies. Need I say more? So please, one more round of applause for Elio Pagliarani and Luigi Ballerini.
Well, after an introduction like that, it's going to be downhill, of course. I'll never live up to it, but I'll do what I can. My task here is to tell you a few things about Elio Pagliarani. And I think I was very fortunate in my life to have met Elio Pagliarani when I was an aspiring poet myself. I wrote my mother while I was waiting for him at a very famous restaurant in Rome, Cesaretto, who appears at a restaurant that is not there anymore in Rome, but it does appear in Pagliarani's poetry every once in a while. And I wrote back to her, "I'm waiting for Elio Pagliarani." She wrote back, "Who is he?" And so that was a little discouraging, but I eventually got around to explain to her why Elio Pagliarani was meaningful to me, and I hope I'll do that in 10 minutes to you. The career of Elio Pagliarani goes back to the 50s. If you are a student of Professor Rumble, of course, you have encountered a very prominent name from the 50s, Pier Paolo Pasolini. So just bring yourself back to that time. Neorealism was the style of literature and film that was being produced in Italy. Pasolini spoke about the great decade, hopes, and reconstruction. Italy had gone through a major world war. Many of you know that there was not only a war, there was also a civil war. Italy was split in two halves. And for 2 years, it was a serious bloodshed that gave rise after the war to a need to reconstruct the country, both physically, materially, and spiritually. And so these first 10 years in Italy were characterized by great enthusiasm and hope for democratic institutions, renewal of the curriculum, and so forth. When it came to poetry, however, I think we have to admit that it sort of lagged behind this great enthusiasm. The great established figure of Italian poetry like Montale and Ungaretti, although they're certainly not close, still dominated the scene. And even when Pasolini began to write with great ideological propositions, mainly of Marxist inspiration, the language that he used was still the language of a few decades before. Now that's what brings Elio Pagliarani on the forefront from the very beginning. Ideologically, you can say that he was on the same wavelength with people like Leonetti, Roversi, people who meant to renew the poetic mode in Italian literature, but differently from them, he intervened in syntax, lexicon, basic things. You know, there was still a time when people believed that there was such thing as poetic language. You could go into a dictionary and select words that were particularly beautiful because a whole tradition had used them over and over again. Now, when Pagliarani comes on the scene, this changes dramatically from day one. I'm not saying that he is as bold as he will eventually be 10 years after his beginning, but certainly that's the primary contribution that Elio Pagliarani has given to Italian poetry. The need to radically change the lexicon and the syntax of, and sometimes to really to distort it, to make it aconsequential. You will see when he reads his poems. I hope he'd bear me out on this statement. Okay, so ideologically we are on the forefront of matters, and then on the language we are even past that point. I'd like to read you a very, very brief poem that was written in 1952. It says, "Now I'm going to business school, but when I grow up I'll be a street sweeper. Outdoors, because I care for Milan and the streets. I want them clean. And really, I love overalls. And I'll give the cops a hand if a couple tramples the grass. And I will spank children acting up, because I remember my grandfather who never wanted to see me play happily. Children must weep. Men go to work." Now you can see that normal, I mean, imagine this is just on the pure contextual level, okay? So this is not necessarily the way in which children are treated in poetry in the 50s or even today for that matter. You know, there's a whole mystique that comes along with children, but when Elio Pagliarani handles them, it's a brutal statement, okay? Here it's not yet the case in which the syntax is fairly traditional, but you can see how the topic of holy childhood is mishandled. Now, I think we want to divide Elio Pagliarani's trajectory as a poet into three major phases. The first one is characterized by a narrative poem called A Girl Named Carla. Sometimes it's just The Girl Carla, but as of yesterday, we decided that the better title would be A Girl Named Carla. We were on the plane. Says, "Don't you think this is a better dactylic scansion?" Yes, okay, so that's it. From now on, the official title is A Girl Named Carla, and in about a year, a book will appear, A Girl Named Carla, and other poems by Elio Pagliarani. Keep your eyes peeled and your ears pricked, because it'll be out there very soon. Fragments of this poem are available in this anthology, The Promised Land, and also in a book called I Novissimi, a seminal anthology of Italian poetry that appeared in 1961, and it opens with Elio Pagliarani. That was one of the major European anthologies to gather new attempts at poetry in Italian language. Now, what characterizes A Girl Named Carla is the fact that, yes, there is a narrative, yet the language is very, very contemporary. The narrative is fragmented, pretty much following a Poundian tradition. And also there are evident signs of collage. Some sections of A Girl Named Carla are lifted by Pagliarani from various sources. And since this is a young lady who is given her sentimental education, her education sentimentale, and she becomes a typist, so that's what she aspires at being, you will see sections lifted from a handbook on how to type with 10 fingers, something that I never managed to accomplish. But, so you can see the story of Carla, and then the story of Carla is put on the back burner, a piece from the manual comes in, and then the story of Carla continues, and then there is a lyrical passage, and then there is a description of Milan, and then we go back to a piece of newspaper that reports on contemporary events. So for the first time, we had a narrative poem, ideologically clear, but also constructed without the presence of the lyrical eye of the narrator. This is a battle that Pagliarani fought from day one. And he reminded me the other day that Pasolini at one point praised his first book over Ragazza Carla, or a girl named Carla, because he said, I think there is much more of you in your first book. And Pagliarani remarked, that's precisely what I want to take out. I am tired of writing poems on my skin. I'm writing choral poetry, pretty much in a Vergian. Was Verga part of the experience of the course? Okay, well, so in that vein, okay? But of course, this is poetry. The second phase is characterized by one poem, which I believe Elio will be reading today. It's called Physics Lesson. And there's also a very interesting anecdote behind it, but I will leave him the pleasure of telling you about that anecdote. And these are poems from the 60s, late 60s, when the atmosphere was no longer very happy. The 60s were characterized by fears. The A-bomb had been built. Everybody waited for the A-bomb to explode every minute or so. There were bomb shelters everywhere. The Russians were building bombs. The Americans were building bombs. It was a very desperate decade that exploded, in fact, in '68 with student revolts, etc., etc. But the A-bomb at the beginning of the 60s especially was a real threat. I mean, people lived with that threat over their head. Then, during this period, Pagliarani had been writing another narrative poem, which came out very late. It began it in I don't know, Rudy comincia nei tardi 50 anche lui, no? In the late 50s, but it was a major opus. It developed over the years. It went through several phases, and eventually it came out in 1995, and it was awarded with a very, very prestigious literary prize, the Viareggio Prize. So that's a phase in which the two previous phases are kind of intertwined and resolved in a new narrative and a new experimental mode. But, of course, Pagliarani is very restless. He never stops. So there's another phase, which is the one in which he is dealing with that he occupies at this particular moment, a phase in which he writes epigrams. Very, very short poem, cutting edge, sometimes quite nasty, and the material with which he writes this poem is, again, taken from Plato, Savonarola, a religious leader of the Renaissance who didn't meet a very nice end. He was burned at stake in Piazza della Signoria, Florence, in 1494. And then even Martin Luther. So you have this very, very short poem taken from books by or about these people, to which Pagliarani has given a completely new beat. In other words, he has collaged lines in a manner that they create a new meaning. So I think in my 5 to 10 minute presentation, I hope I've given you a trajectory, if nothing else. Then we'll ask Pagliarani to read, and after, perhaps we can clarify some of the points through a period of question and answers. Is that okay? Okay. So, well, no, you don't have to bear with me anymore. So, let's hear Pagliarani, okay? Allora Elio, se tu vuoi leggere dalla... Sì, ok. I think la lezione di fisica facciamo perché... Yes, physics lesson is the one... Yes, we're going to read first.
leggerò il componimento che dà il titolo a tutta una raccolta, un libricino. La lezione di fisica. La lezione di fisica è stata scritta nei primi anni 60, 61, 62. E la nostra generazione, è vissuta soprattutto con l'incubo della bomba atomica e ci sono proprio dei fatti epocali, come si dice, che segnano magari generazioni e generazioni, come, non so, i fatti epocali, le 2 guerre mondiali in Europa, più grave, più pericoloso per il futuro, quello della bomba atomica. È un altro fatto epocale, secondo me, che cambia proprio i rapporti nel mondo, e anche l'attentato di settembre a New York. È un altro fatto epocale che cambia. Va bene. Sì.
So this poem was written in the early 60s, okay? Physics lesson. It is also the title of a book, La lezione di fisica, which was published in those years. And Pagliarani wants you to keep in mind that this nightmare of the A-bomb was an epochal fact, something that changed the perspective on civilization that people had before and afterwards, such as World War I, World War II, and in a certain way even the Twin Towers, the attack on the Twin Towers. You know, those are moments that radically change history. There's no going back.
Un altro motivo per cui mi fa piacere leggervi questa poesia, questa poesia, questo componimento, la lezione di fisica, è perché è stata tradotta in inglese e pubblicata anche parecchi anni fa a New York in una rivista
New
Direction, che è stata questa poesia sulla lezione di fisica è stata tradotta si potrebbe dire dalla figlia della bomba atomica, paradosso. È stata tradotta da Fausta Segre.